I'm a registered dietitian based in New Zealand, and my work forms a combination of research at the university, AUT University in Auckland, New Zealand, and I'm a private practicing dietitian.
You just said that you are a private practicing dietitian. Mm-hmm. How many years have you been practicing as a dietitian?
For coming up 21 years.
And you said that you are also a researcher.
I started my academic career, my academic journey in the year 2000, and I went to work for AUT University, and there I undertook my master's in nutrition and my PhD in nutrition, and got involved in some group-based research.
Where did you obtain your first degree, which was a BSc in dietetics?
Both of those undergraduate degrees were undertaken at UCT, and the first one was a BSc with a physiology major, and the second one, which was actually a postgrad qualification, was a dietetics also at UCT.
What qualification did you obtain at the AUT University?
In 2004, I obtained my Master of Health Science, and that was a focus on nutrition, and then in 2012, I obtained my PhD.
How many affiliations that you'd like to tell Madam Chair about?
Yes, I am affiliated with the Dietitians Board of New Zealand, so I'm registered with them and have been since 1996. I'm also a member of the Professional Body Dietitians New Zealand, which is a national body of dietitians. I'm also on the scientific committee for sports nutrition for the New Zealand Nutrition Foundation. And just recently I have been asked to be an international advisor or advisory board member to the Public Health Commission, which is a UK organisation. The last one is just a Sport and Exercise Science New Zealand accreditation.
What was your master's degree about?
My master's degree looked at nutrition knowledge and the relationship between nutrition knowledge and nutrition behaviour.
And what were your findings?
My findings were that, in essence, there's a disconnect between knowledge and behaviour. It was in a sports nutrition capacity, and we looked at rugby coaches, and we looked at their level of knowledge, what they knew, and what they did in terms of nutrition. And we found that there was definitely a disconnect, but more importantly, there was an issue with how nutrition knowledge is measured in the literature due to the lack of validated questionnaires or instruments. So one of my studies of my master's was to validate a sports nutrition questionnaire.
And tell us about your doctoral degree.
So my doctoral degree, because I'm a practicing dietitian, I really wanted my doctoral degree to be to have an element of practice. So what I did was there were two main components. The first component was looking at all the private practicing dietitians in New Zealand and looking at how they consult, what sort of nutrition paradigms they use, what their consultation strategies look like. And also, from a quantitative point of view, what I did was look at the outcomes of their weight loss patients over a 1-year period. So we really wanted to find out how successful private practice dietitians were in helping their clients to lose weight and to keep it off at that 1-year mark. The second component of the PhD was a randomized controlled trial that I did. And it was based on weight loss maintenance. So it was my belief, and that's echoed in the literature, that you can pretty much jump up and down and people will lose weight, but it's keeping it off long term that is the major problem. So what I did was designed what I called a small changes intervention that was based on a dietary consultation. And it was done at a workplace, so employees had to change every few weeks. They had to make a change to their nutrition, a small change to their physical activity, and also a small change to their mindfulness. So the two groups followed this kind of intervention for 12 weeks, and then one group we did mini interventions for 9 months, and the other group we just left them alone, and we followed them up for 12 months to see who had maintained and who had not maintained.
Did your research consider the energy input, energy output model?
Yeah, when I did my PhD, it was before I shifted my thinking towards the LCHF paradigm. So the lens through which I undertook my PhD was very much mainstream. So the small changes that we applied to the participants were really just small calorie reduced changes. So for example, instead of having 2 cups of pasta for dinner, you have 1.5 cups of pasta for dinner, and instead of walking 100 meters, you walk 200 meters. So it was very much through not really manipulating the macronutrients as I would do now probably, but more so just looking at reducing portion size, reducing total calories, and of course what comes with reducing total calories is keeping total fat intake low, because fat's high in calories.
Would you be able to comment on whether you can outrun a bad diet? I think some people can outrun a bad diet temporarily at the expense of being incredibly hungry and at the expense of doing copious quantities of exercise to get that weight off and keep it off, which is unsustainable. But what was really interesting for me, and it's only been in the last few years that I've reflected on the outcomes of my PhD, the outcomes were that only a third of the group, both looking at the private practice dietitian's outcomes looking at my employee outcomes, only about a third of the group were able to lose weight and keep it off long term, which is that 1 year period. And we're talking about a minimum of 5% weight loss, which was considered to be the smallest meaningful effect for health outcomes at the time. So it's an interesting concept to think that people pay dietitians good money to lose weight, and they can actually gain weight in the process. So that's something to be reflective about. But again, now with my deeper level of knowledge of the literature and the biology, what I think about is perhaps that third of the population might be the third that is not insulin resistant. And the rest of the people might be insulin resistant and are unable to stick to or to adhere to a diet that is full of carbohydrate and very little fat. Can you say anything about exercise and weight loss?
I think looking at the mainstream paradigm, exercise becomes an important component to lose weight and keep it off. Now, don't get me wrong, I think exercise is incredibly important, but I think it's important from an independent health effect and from an enjoyment point of view. But in the old paradigm, in my head, I would use exercise as a means to burn calories. And I just don't think that's sustainable these days. And these days I use exercise in my practice and in my research more for an independent health contribution rather than a calorie burning strategy.
Can you tell Madam Chair about your work experience?
Okay, so I moved to New Zealand in 1996, and for the first 4 years I worked as a public health dietitian in a rural area of New Zealand, and that work involved developing and implementing and evaluating nutrition programs in a public health sense to address the problems of the population, which are fairly similar, chronic disease, overweight, diabetes. And then in the year 2000, I applied for a job in academia. I'm not thinking that I would get it because I didn't even have a master's, and nowadays you wouldn't get into academia without a PhD. But at the time, I managed to get the job and started my academic career as a teacher, lecturer, and researcher. While I've got an academic job, I think of myself more so as a practitioner, and for the last almost 21 years, I have maintained my dietetic practice, and that's something that I feel is incredibly beneficial, that informs both my teaching and my research, and vice versa.
In the area of research, have you published any books or any articles?
Yes, I have a range of publications, and I say range because the area of work is fairly diverse in the nutrition field. I do want to say that I have some publications that are in press and in submission that don't necessarily appear on the evidence that we have, but I think they're important to mention because they focus on the nutrition in the LCHF kind of area. I have in submission. I've got a paper that looks at a study we did on multi-sporters and the ketogenic diet. I've got a study that I've submitted for a randomized controlled trial we did with the Navy, the Defence Force in New Zealand, and I also have one looking at a feasibility study we did on children called Low Carb Kids. I've got one in press at the moment. One of my master's students looked at LCHF for powerlifters. In terms of what's been published, there's a range. I first authored my PhD work, which looked at weight loss and health outcomes of the employees at the workplace in the randomized controlled trial. I've done a bit of work looking at Pacific Islands women's experiences of going on LCHF. I've also been involved in some work looking at homework strategies for young children to improve physical activity and nutrition patterns. There are various others, but I do want to make specific mention to the ones by Dr. Crofts, Catherine Crofts. She was our PhD student who just graduated. And these three publications are really important because what they have done is they've put a condition on the map called hyperinsulinemia. It's a really good hangman word if anyone plays. It's quite a mouthful. And why this work is really important is as follows. She's a pharmacist, and she really has had enough of prescribing medication, and she thought there must be something more to this. So she came to us at AUT, and she studied. She focused her PhD studies on hyperinsulinemia, and it's an interesting story. Thanks to social media, she connected with a 95-year-old pathologist in Chicago who basically gave her his life work of glucose curves and insulin curves of 14,000 individuals. And he said, I'm happy if you wanted to use this for your PhD and to reanalyze the data and make sense of it. And this is probably the most groundbreaking work that I have been involved with from a research perspective, because what it does show was that out of the population that she looked at, there was a certain percentage of that population, a substantial portion of that population, that showed perfectly normal glucose curves, but it was in the presence of high insulin levels postprandially. So what does that mean in terms of
What will postprandially?
Sorry, after a meal has been eaten. So what she got this work from Dr. Kraft, and what Dr. Kraft did was he undertook glucose tolerance tests, and he gave a bolus of carbohydrate and measured glucose over a 5-hour period once that bolus had been consumed. And he also looked at insulin curves. And like I said, there was a substantial portion of the population that found that they were seemingly normal in terms of fasting glucose and fasting insulin. In other words, if they went to the doctor and they saw those parameters, the doctor would say that for all intents and purposes, these figures are normal. But what they failed to do, the diagnostics just aren't there at the moment, is look at insulin curves after they've eaten. So there were large portions of the population that were in normal glucose homeostasis, or had normal glucose curves, but their insulin levels stayed raised, and there was a prolonged drop back to normal. And that is the start of disease. Hyperinsulinemia has extensive links to chronic disease. And I think that work is really, really good to put hyperinsulinemia on the map as its own chronic disease, rather than a symptom of metabolic syndrome, which could possibly only be detected and diagnosed 10 years later.
You also mentioned some studies or some publications in relation to low-carb children.
Mm-hmm.
Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Yes, we were lucky enough to get the Health Research Council, which is our major funding body, to fund a feasibility study. So it was a one-arm trial, it wasn't a randomized controlled trial or anything, it was one-armed, to look at the feasibility of a low-carbohydrate, high-fat diet on children over a 12-week period. And we did that, and we found some really good outcomes with that. It wasn't necessarily an efficacy study because we drew on the literature which already showed the efficacy. Our research was primarily to look at the translation of this concept into our local population, and what we looked at was things like affordability of it, acceptability of it, how the families dealt with it, what the barriers were, and of course we looked at efficacy measures as well.
Was it literature that was related to the low carbohydrate, high fat diet?
You know, I think the literature available for children is not extensive. It certainly doesn't compare to the literature available for low carb, high fat in adults. But the body of literature that we had to draw on was a mixture between randomized controlled trials, case studies. They were very heterogeneous studies, so they had very different methodologies. They ranged from an 8-week trial right through to a 12-month trial. They looked at as low as 20 grams of carbohydrate in the diet to 30% of carbohydrate. So the studies are quite varied, and I don't think there's enough information to provide consensus on one better macronutrient contribution. But the reality is that those studies showed that low carbohydrate, high fat diets in children were just as good, and if not better in some cases, than mainstream for the children that they were studying.
Dr. Zinn, that article, was it peer reviewed prior to doing the study? Would the study have been allowed to be done?
I guess we draw on evidence, and we have to apply for ethics, and I guess even though it was a very limited body of studies, we didn't have any problem with ethics at all. And the literature that we had, some of it was all of it was peer reviewed, but some of it was case studies, not necessarily RCTs. That was enough evidence to allow ethics to be obtained and everything to run smoothly. We had a data monitoring committee, even though we didn't necessarily need to do one, and we did everything that we did to make sure it was safe, and of course it was.